Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Darren Calloway. Before the world went quiet, I was a maintenance tech at a regional airport out in the middle of nowhere. I was the invisible guy in grease-stained coveralls, the one with the badge that beeped open the side doors regular folks never saw. I pushed a heavy tool cart down silent service hallways while passengers on the other side of the wall argued at the gate about delayed connections and lost luggage. My work was simple enough to explain even if nobody cared to listen. Check hydraulic fluids, swap out clogged filters, log pressure variance, listen for rattles that didn't belong, and sign off on the paperwork when the numbers finally matched the specs. If a tug wouldn't turn over in the cold, they radioed me. If a runway light burned out at 3 a.m., they called me. If a plane was leaking something it wasn't supposed to leak, it landed on my clipboard. I wasn't a pilot. I definitely wasn't a soldier or any kind of hero. I was just a repair guy who appreciated systems that behaved when you treated them right. Planes made sense to me in a way people didn't. They were just metal, wiring, fuel, and physics, rules that didn't give a damn how you felt that day. If something failed, there was a tangible reason, and if you had the time and the spare parts, you could usually fix it. Life outside the perimeter fence was small on purpose. A one-bedroom apartment with thin walls, a rusted-out pickup truck with more tools in the bed than groceries, and a diner down the road where the waitress knew my order before I sat down. I had a few buddies from the night shift. We'd trade dumb memes when a flight got diverted, but that was it. No big plans. No grand delusions about the future. Keep the lights on, keep the turbines spinning, and grab a day off when the storms cleared and traffic dipped. Looking back from where I'm sitting now, inside this frozen wreck, it's strange how safe that boredom felt. The warning signs were flashing long before anything actually broke in front of us. We just kept working the checklist, assuming someone somewhere else was handling the rest. The first rumble about trouble in the skies didn't come through an official memo. It started as a joke in the break room. I was polishing off a sandwich when a gate agent wandered in, shaking his head, and mentioned a plane 2 states over had pulled a U-turn because a passenger completely lost their marbles halfway through the flight. Someone cracked a joke about lightweight travelers who couldn't handle a little turbulence. We all chuckled, finished our lunch, and went back to dealing with our own headaches. But by Friday, the jokes weren't landing anymore. We stopped hearing stories about one drunk guy or a single panic attack. The rumors turned into reports of entire rows of passengers getting sick simultaneously, brawls breaking out in the aisles, and flight crews locking themselves in the galley because they'd lost control of the cabin. The local news started buzzing about some nasty, fast-moving flu that seemed to hit without any warning signs. Fever, total confusion, violent outbursts. Every time the anchor insisted it was rare and contained. The footage rolling behind them showed someone being pinned down by 3 or 4 people while medics struggled to strap a mask over their face. That didn't look contained to me. That looked like a war zone. Out on the tarmac, it was business as usual. Planes landed, planes took off. Inside, passengers still stood in long lines for overpriced coffee and groaned when boarding dragged on. Management spammed our inboxes with emails about proper hygiene and staying home if we felt off, then slapped a bottle of hand sanitizer on every desk like that was going to stop whatever was coming. The real shift hit me when we started talking differently about diverted flights. Before, a divert usually meant something mechanical and mundane. A warning light on the dash, a weird vibration in the turbine, minor stuff that just needed a signature before the bird could fly again. Now, when a flight got diverted, voices dropped to a whisper. The first question wasn't what broke. It was, is it one of those flights? One afternoon, a small regional jet came in hot, landing hard with a convoy of emergency vehicles already racing alongside it down the runway. The radio chatter called it a medical emergency, multiple passengers down. I was sitting in my truck near the maintenance hangars and watched it roll to a stop way down the strip, far from the gates. Even from that distance, I could see faces pressed tight against the portholes and one arm hammering against the glass with a rhythm that didn't look like someone waving for help. It looked frantic. Dispatch told us to hold our positions until security and medical teams cleared the zone. Nobody argued. We stood by the hangar bay doors watching a perimeter form, ambulances, security cruisers, and a black van from some agency I didn't recognize. They rigged up tarps between the aircraft stairs and the terminal windows to block the view. That's when it clicked for me. They weren't worried about panic at 30,000 feet anymore. They were terrified of panic right here on the ground. After that day, we saw more caution tape than passengers. Entire restroom blocks were closed for deep cleaning and never reopened. A hallway leading to the commuter gates went dark, blocked off by a plastic chain and a heavy guard presence. When I pressed another tech for info, he muttered that they'd shifted the quarantine zone closer and that we should keep our mouths shut where the cameras could read our lips. At home, the news just got uglier. Videos started leaking from inside the planes before they even touched down. Grainy, shaky cell phone footage showed people in aisle seats strapped down with zip ties, snapping their teeth at anyone who got too close. There was one clip of a guy in a window seat slamming his head against the plexiglass in short, violent bursts while the woman next to him sobbed, trying desperately to scramble over the seatback to get away. The internet was a dumpster fire of theories. Some claimed it was just mass hysteria made worse by cramped cabins and fear. Others swore some infection was attacking the brain directly, claiming that if you were trapped in a metal tube with a sick person, you were already done for. A few holdouts still called it a hoax. But sitting in my cramped kitchen scrolling through my phone, I knew one thing for sure. The people in those videos didn't look drunk and they didn't look scared. They looked gone. Just empty vessels locked into whatever violent loop was playing in their heads. Then the paperwork changed. We stopped getting updates on engine specs or hydraulic systems. Instead, we got checklists on what to do if a plane arrived with suspected cases. Keep your distance. Don't crack the doors unless authorized. Wait for the hazmat team. There were a hell of a lot more warnings than solutions. As the days dragged on, the departure board started bleeding red with cancellations. Nobody told us to go home, though. Management kept parroting the same lines in every briefing. We were critical infrastructure. People needed to move. Cargo needed to flow. We were essential. That word hit different now. It didn't mean we were important. It meant we didn't have an escape hatch. We were expected to stay on the ground servicing planes until there were no planes left to service. One night, an old-timer mechanic named Harris sat next to me in the break room. We were watching a report about a flight that had turned into a mass casualty incident mid-air. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then looked at me and said, "These birds are gonna start falling out of the sky, kid." I asked him what he meant. He tapped his knuckles on the table. "You can't keep packing sick people into a pressurized tube across a continent and expect every flight crew to win the fight in the back. The pilots are human. All it takes is one breach, one slip." I wanted to tell him he was being dramatic, just an old man spooking himself. Instead, I finished my coffee in silence and went back to the line. A few days later, when the alerts started coming in faster than we could read them, I thought about Harris and really wished he'd been wrong. The day the frozen wreck arrived started like any other grinding shift. I was running on burnt coffee that tasted like battery acid, scrolling through a backlog of work orders on my phone, and nursing a headache on the drive-in before the sun even cracked the horizon. The highway was a ghost town, mostly empty except for a few long-haul truckers. I parked in my usual spot out in the employee lot, clipped my badge to my collar, and tried to convince myself that the knot tightening in my chest was just indigestion and not a premonition. Inside the terminal, the vibe was off from the moment the automatic doors slid open. The lobby was too quiet for that hour, an eerie, muffled silence. There were fewer rolling bags clattering on the tile and way too many people standing frozen staring at departure boards that were lighting up red with cancellations. A young couple at the ticket counter was arguing for a refund, not a rebooking, and the agent looked exhausted, her voice flat as she repeated that she didn't know when things would get better. She looked like she was done lying. Halfway through the morning, the radio on my hip exploded with static and shouting. Ops was yelling at security, security was screaming for medical, and the tower was trying to cut through the noise to override them both. The words overlapped into a mess of panic, but I caught enough to piece it together. An inbound flight had multiple violent passengers, a compromised cabin, and a pilot demanding priority landing. There was no chatter about diverting to a different airport or holding a pattern to burn fuel. They were coming down right now, whether we were ready for them or not. I walked out to the edge of the ramp near the maintenance hangars, where I had a clear line of sight to the main runway. The sky was a flat, oppressive gray, and a thin layer of snow was already drifting over the far end of the strip, blurring the runway lights. A few descent trucks sat idle, their crews standing on the tarmac watching the sky instead of prepping their rigs. When the loudspeaker crackled to announce an emergency landing in progress, every head snapped in the same direction. Nobody said a word. Then the plane broke through the low cloud ceiling, coming in way lower and faster than it should have. I recognized the livery and the tail paint instantly. It was one of ours. Its nose was riding dangerously high, and the starboard wing dipped enough to make my jaw clench. The engine sounded ragged, surging and cutting out like the pilot was fighting the auto throttle. It hit the runway hard, slamming down with a force that shook the ground, bounced once and then smashed back down in a spray of snow and rubber smoke before the pilot wrestled it straight. It didn't take the usual taxi exit. It blew right past it, rolling toward the far end of the airfield, finally slowing enough to drag itself onto a remote side taxiway and stop at a crooked angle. From where I stood, I could see faces pressed against the portholes, panicked and distorted. One set of hands pounded the glass 3 times, thump, 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 before being yanked away. Whatever was happening inside that aluminum tube, it wasn't a simple medical issue, it was a brawl. Emergency vehicles were rolling before the plane even came to a complete stop. Fire trucks, ambulances, and a security cruiser sped out in a loose, chaotic line, lights flashing against the gray morning. I climbed into the cab of a maintenance truck and stayed put for the higher vantage point, pressing the radio against my ear. Ops was barking orders, all ground traffic hold position, maintenance stand by. No one, absolutely no one, goes near that aircraft without a direct order from the tower. The plane sat there with its nose slightly off-center, engines winding down into a high-pitched whine before dying out. For a few seconds, the airfield felt wrong. It was too quiet. Then a cabin door handle moved. The door jumped in its frame like someone kicked it, cracked open, and was immediately forced shut again from the inside. The ambulances halted well short of the wings while people in full protective hazmat suits climbed out of a black van and began rolling portable stairs toward the fuselage. I watched one of them lock the stairs in place and hammer on the door with a heavy gloved fist. After a tense pause, the door cracked open again. I couldn't see faces clearly at that distance, but I saw movement. Fast, jerky, unnatural motion in the shadows behind the crew member. Arms straining against seatbelts, heads snapping toward the opening in unison. The way they moved made my skin crawl. It looked predatory. Someone on my radio hissed that there were multiple violent subjects on board and that some were attempting to bite the crew. Another voice immediately cut in, ordering them to move that traffic to a secure encrypted channel and stop broadcasting it on open air. Too late. We'd all heard it. The suited team started extracting people down the stairs in small clusters. Some passengers walked on their own, stumbling, hands held out to show they were empty. Others had their wrists zip-tied together in front of them. One man fought so hard it took 3 large men to hold him as they dragged him down each step. His jaw was working nonstop, teeth bared at the air, snapping at anyone who got within range. When he screamed, the sound cut across the ramp like a siren, raw and guttural. It made the hair on my arms stand up. That didn't sound like fear. It sounded like something that had gone way past reasoning or pain. A security officer nearby instinctively raised his weapon halfway, then lowered it quickly when a suit grabbed his arm and shook his head. After that, the scene turned into a grim loop. The door opened. A cluster of yellow suits filled the gap. Another passenger was dragged down, another coded update went over the radio. At one point, the door shut and stayed closed for a long time. Voices on the radio went short, tight, and professional. We were told again to stay clear. No one without full biogear was allowed within 100 yards. A message went out that the terminal was going into temporary lockdown, and nobody around me even blinked. We expected it. The snow started to fall harder, sticking to the top of the fuselage and frosting the tail fin. The plane that had come in too fast and stopped in the wrong place stopped looking like an emergency in motion and started looking like a curse parked on the edge of the field. It wasn't at a gate. It wasn't at a hangar. It just sat there on the taxiway, dead and cold. Too dangerous to bring in and too important to ignore. That was the first day the frozen wreck became ours. I didn't know it yet. Sitting there with cold fingers gripping the steering wheel of a truck I wasn't allowed to move, but that crooked plane out on the taxiway had already tied its fate to mine. It wasn't going to leave again, and pretty soon I'd have to decide whether I was leaving either. They left the damaged plane out there rotting on the tarmac for 3 whole days. Snow built up along the landing gear and drifted under the wings until the bird looked half buried like some forgotten relic from a different era. Every time I passed it in my truck, squinting through the windshield, I wondered why the hell it was still sitting out in the open. The official word from upstairs was quarantine protocol. The real reason? Nobody wanted that cursed metal tube any closer to the terminal than it already was. It was a pariah. On the second day, a crew in full biohazard suits, looking like yellow astronauts against the gray sky, went out with a power cart. I watched from the edge of the ramp, sipping cold coffee as they hooked thick cables to the belly and pushed a narrow set of stairs to the forward cabin door. They moved in slow motion, deliberate and terrified, touching only what they absolutely had to before retreating back to their van. Inside the terminal, the board was a sea of red, cancellations stacked up row by row. Flights slid from delayed to canceled in real time. Passengers argued with the gate staff, screaming until they ran out of breath, then gave up and collapsed against their luggage piles. The security lines shrank to nothing. There was almost no one left to screen, and even fewer TSA agents willing to show up to do the screening. A memo went out saying only mission-critical staff should report. Nobody explicitly said maintenance could leave, so we stayed. We just kept fixing things that didn't matter anymore. On the third day, the airport director called an all-hands meeting. We crammed into a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and nervous sweat. He stood at the head of the table, looking gray and washed out, and told us passenger flights were being grounded. Indefinitely. Cargo might run a little longer to move supplies, but anything with a pulse on it was done. We were told to secure our equipment, finish any urgent work orders, and be ready to either lock down the facility or evacuate on short notice. Someone from the back raised a hand and asked what leave actually meant. The director didn't even look up from his notes. He just muttered that anyone who had a place outside the city might want to think about getting there before the roads turned into parking lots. That was the closest thing to permission, or a warning, we were ever going to get. On paper, going home made sense. I had an apartment with a deadbolt. I had a truck. There were highways that led out of town. If I packed up right now and floored it, I might beat the traffic and whatever nightmare was chasing it. But then I pictured the interstate. I saw myself boxed in on the highway, surrounded by thousands of scared drivers, gridlocked, nowhere to turn, running out of gas while the world fell apart around us. The idea didn't feel like escape. It felt like a trap. A steel coffin on wheels. I finished my shift running on pure muscle memory. I checked a fuel pump that would probably never pump another gallon. I signed off on a safety form that no one would ever read. When quitting time finally came, I didn't clock out. Instead, I walked through the service corridor to the heavy double doors that led to the ramp. I stopped there, staring out at the runway and that crooked, lonely plane sitting at the far end of the world. The terminal behind me was still full of artificial light and noise, people still pretending someone was in control, that there was a plan. The city beyond the perimeter fence was already fraying at the edges, smoke rising in the distance. But that wreck? It sat between the chaos and the nothingness on a slab of bare concrete, isolated with a thick metal skin and only a few ways in. It was broken, sure, but it was defensible, and it was empty. Every news report I'd heard said the same thing, just in different panicked tones. The infection tore through crowds. It loved packed rooms, buses, trains, apartment blocks. Anywhere people shared air and panic. The places that lasted longer were the ones that stayed quiet, spread out, and locked down. That wreck out there was about as quiet and spread out as this place could offer. I told myself I just wanted a closer look before I made any real decisions. I grabbed a set of keys from the hook, signed out a small utility truck, and drove down the service road that hugged the perimeter fence. The farther I got from the terminal, the more the airport sounds fell away. No PA announcements, no clatter of baggage carts, no low hum of voices. Just the rumble of my engine, the biting wind, and the crunch of thin ice shattering under my tires. Near the far corner of the field, I stopped and killed the engine. The plane sat 50 yards away, its nose turned slightly off-center, dusted with fresh white snow. The windows were dark, dead eyes staring back at me. No ground crew, no flashing strobes, no movement around it at all. It looked like a ghost ship. I swiped my badge on a side gate and stepped out onto the taxiway. The air felt sharper here, away from the heated buildings. It bit at my exposed skin. Each step left a clean, crisp print in the snow. I walked in a wide arc, keeping my distance, scanning the fuselage. No motion behind the glass, no screaming from the cabin, just the soft, rhythmic rattle of a loose panel somewhere on the hull when the wind gusted. Up close, the violence of the landing was clearer. The nose gear sat at a sickening angle, twisted slightly to the left. One engine nacelle had a long, ugly scrape along the bottom where it had kissed the tarmac. But none of it looked like a death sentence for the airframe. It looked like a machine that could fly again if only the world around it hadn't gone sideways. I stopped right under the forward door and looked up. The same narrow metal stairs the hazmat team had used were still there, a strip of yellow warning tape flapping uselessly from the handrail. I put my hand on the cold metal of the first step and stood frozen for a few seconds, just listening. No footsteps, no voices, no thumps. Just the wind. The creaking metal and the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. Walking into a quarantined plane without orders would have been a firing offense a week ago. Unthinkable. Now, the rules felt dissolved. I knew how this infection worked. Close contact, bites, fluids. Inside this plane, I could control the distance. I could lock the door. On a crowded road or in a packed stairwell, I couldn't control a damn thing. I told myself I would just go in far enough to check the power status, maybe see the layout with the seats empty. If it felt wrong, if I got that hair-raising feeling on the back of my neck, I would walk right back down these stairs, get in my truck, and drive home like the director suggested. My hand stayed on the rail while I had that thought, but my feet made the decision for me. They carried me up. At the top of the stairs, I took one last deep breath of the freezing air, turned the latch, and stepped into the dark, silent belly of the plane that was about to become my only address. The first thing that hit me inside wasn't the smell of death. Not yet. It was the smell of abandonment. It was the heavy, stale odor of recycled air that had been trapped in a metal tube for 3 days, mixed with the sticky sweetness of spilled soda, old coffee, and the faint chemical tang of industrial disinfectant. The cabin lights were dead, leaving only a faint, ghostly line of photoluminescent emergency strips glowing on the floor, fading into the darkness toward the tail. I stood just inside the door, gripping the frame until my knuckles turned white, and listened. Nothing. No shuffling in the aisle, no whispered prayers, no ragged coughing. The quarantine team had already dragged out whoever or whatever was still worth moving. I walked forward, keeping one hand on the seatbacks for balance in the gloom. A few overhead bins hung open like gaping mouths. A suit jacket lay twisted on the floor in the aisle, one sleeve inside out. Halfway down the cabin, I saw the first real sign. blood smeared along a leather armrest and dripping down the side of the seat into the carpet. No body, no drag marks, just a dark, rusty stain in the low light. I stepped wide around that row, my boots making no sound on the thick carpet, and kept moving. At the forward galley, I checked compartments, methodical as if I were checking a parts cabinet. Small bottles of water, packets of salted nuts and crackers, a few sealed metal carts that held more trays. It wasn't a feast, but it was enough to matter while I decided if this aluminum shell was worth the risk. I dragged two of the smaller carts forward and locked their wheels by the bulkhead. The cockpit door was closed. I pressed my ear against the reinforced seam. Silence. I unlocked it and pushed it open, foot braced to kick it shut if I had to. The flight deck was empty. 2 dead seats, dead instrument panels, and a panoramic view of the snowy, desolate field through the windshield. That was the moment the idea shifted from a desperate maybe to something real. The cockpit wasn't just a workspace anymore, it was a fortress. It had one heavy reinforced door, bullet-resistant glass, and a clear line of sight in 3 directions. I could barricade that single door easier than I could defend an apartment in a building full of panic. From up here, I could see anyone coming a mile away. I sat in the captain's seat on the left and tried to reframe the space in my head. It wasn't a flight deck. It was a room. There was enough floor space to sleep if I cleared the center console panels. Storage cubbies under the windows for gear. Heavy brackets on the sidewalls where I could rig a steel bar across the door to make it unbreachable. But survival is more than just walls. Heat came first. Without it, none of the other plans mattered. The cold would kill me faster than any virus. The ground power carts outside weren't going to stay running forever. I needed a stove, a metal box that could hold a small fire and vent smoke outside without gassing me out. Water was next. Snow covered everything outside, an infinite supply. Melt the snow, get water. Simple physics, but not free. It takes fuel to turn enough snow into something worth drinking. Security came down to friction. I already had height. If I could figure out a way to retract the stairs or at least block the bottom with heavy pallets and chocks. Anything hostile would have to fight uphill in the open, making plenty of noise doing it. I scribbled a list on the back of an old maintenance tag. Stove body, flue pipe, extra blankets, tools, rope, food. Anything I pulled from the hangars had to fit in a small truck bed and move fast. Leaving the cockpit felt harder than it should have. I felt exposed again. I forced myself to walk back down the aisle, past the bloodstain, and out to the freezing taxiway. The maintenance yard was still ours. I drove there with the headlights off and backed the truck up to a scrap metal pile. I picked through the junk until I found a short, heavy steel drum, probably an old grease barrel, and a length of galvanized vent pipe. I added a flat steel panel for a base and a crate of hand tools. Inside the nearest hangar, I raided the crew lockers. I grabbed 2 heavy wool blankets, a coil of nylon rope, and a pair of thick leather work gloves. On the way out, I stopped at the break room vending machine. The lights were dead. I didn't have change, and I didn't have patience. I cracked the glass with the heavy butt of a pipe wrench. The crash echoed in the empty hangar like a gunshot, and filled a canvas bag with whatever granola bars and chips fell free. It felt like a crime, looting the place that had paid my wages for 10 years, but then I remembered the silence outside. There was nobody left to arrest me, and I needed the calories more than the vendor needed the inventory. Back at the plane, I parked close and carried everything up in slow, agonizing trips. My breath steamed in the air. I stacked the gear inside the cockpit and wedged a heavy tool case against the door. Building the stove took the rest of the fading daylight. I set the flat steel panel on the cockpit floor away from the vital wiring bundles. The drum went on top. I used tin snips to cut a rough hole in the rim, then forced the vent pipe into it until it sat tight, hammering the edges down to seal it. Cutting a path for the pipe out of the plane felt wrong, sacrilegious. Planes are pressurized vessels. They are built to keep air in, not vent smoke out. I picked a small side window, cracked the inner pane, and worked the rest out with careful blows until the opening was just big enough. I fed the steel tube through, careful not to slice my hand on the jagged plexiglass, and packed the gap tight with aluminum foil and strips of torn blanket to insulate it. For fuel, I used broken pallet boards and chocks. I lit a small fire in the drum using a page from a flight manual. The flame caught. The first curl of smoke went up the pipe and out into the cold. Heat radiated from the metal, slow but steady. I sat on the floor back against the bulkhead, hands near the warm drum. I listened to the metal tick as it expanded. The only light was the orange glow of the fire reflecting on the dead screens. It wasn't much. Thin heat, stolen food, and a door I could block. But it was a start, and for tonight, it was mine. The first night in the cockpit was a test of resolve. It was a question of how much I really wanted to survive versus how easy it would be to just let the cold take over. I fed the stove in small, miserly handfuls, keeping the flame low. I sat with my back pressed against the bulkhead, boots still laced tight, wrapped in itchy wool blankets that smelled of oil and dust. The plane felt alive in the worst way. As the temperature dropped outside, the aluminum hull contracted. The frame groaned and popped. Every snap of metal sounded like a footstep on the stairs. Every gust of wind that rattled the fuselage sounded like a hand trying the latch. I spent hours staring at the dark shape of the door. I slept in jagged, terrified pieces, jolting awake every 20 minutes with my hand clamped around the cold steel of a pipe wrench. By morning, the inside of the cockpit glass was frosted over with a thick layer of ice where my breath had hit it. The fire was dead ash. My water bottle, sitting just a few feet from the stove, was slush. The heat wasn't a comfort, it was barely a lifeline. It was the thin line between enduring this nightmare and being found frozen stiff in my own shelter. I started the day by taking inventory. In the galley, I cracked open the sealed service carts, checking expiration dates like a quartermaster. It was slim pickings, mini bottles of water, foil packets of salted nuts, sleeves of dry crackers, a few trays of shelf-stable meals that probably tasted like cardboard. It wasn't enough to live on for long, maybe a week if I starved myself a little, but it was enough to buy me time. I stacked everything in one overhead bin near the front and marked it with blue tape so I could grab it fast. Water was the immediate problem. I grabbed a plastic bin, stepped out onto the wing, and cleared a strip with a gloved hand. I shoved clean snow into the bin until it was packed tight. Back inside, I set it near the stove to melt. It took a ridiculous amount of snow to make a pitiful amount of water, but I had nothing but time, and wandering far from the plane felt like a death wish. Then came security. I didn't need anything high-tech. I just needed a warning system, a doorbell for the apocalypse. I found a spool of safety wire and a box of maintenance tags with metal rings. I ran short lengths of the wire between the wheel chocks and the landing gear struts, stringing the tags so they would clink if disturbed. I tied one tripwire across the base of the stairs low enough to catch a foot. It was crude, but in the dead silence of the airfield, a metal clink would sound like a gunshot. Back inside, I looked for weak points. The main door seals were solid. I dragged a few rows of loose seats into the aisle near the front, cinching them tight with belts to create a choke point. One hostile at a time, forced into a bottleneck I might handle. A crowd would tear me apart. I had been living in the wreck for 2 days when I saw the first one. I was in the cockpit cleaning tools when a shape moved near the far fence. At first, I thought it was a straggler. Then I saw the walk. The figure moved in a jagged, erratic straight line, plowing through snowdrifts rather than walking around them. It stumbled, caught itself with a jerky motion, and then turned its head toward the sound of its own stumble. Its arms hung too far from its sides. Its head twitched from left to right with every step, scanning. I froze in the captain's seat and watched. The thing reached the access road, hesitated, and followed the pavement toward the runway. It didn't seem to have a destination. It was just reacting. When a sign banged in the wind, it snapped toward it. When a distant slam echoed, it whipped around. It was being pulled by noise. It took a long time for it to reach the edge of the concrete near my plane. Through the window, I got a good look. Torn clothes fluttering in the wind, bare, frostbitten hands, a face that was slack and gray, indifferent to the cold. No hat, no gloves, no shivering. Its eyes didn't track the plane like shelter. They tracked edges and shadows, darting around like they were hunting a sound they had lost. It came within 20 feet of the stairs and stopped dead. It sniffed the air once, a fast, sharp inhalation, and started a slow circle around the nose. When its foot hit the low wire, the tags rattled. Clink, clink. The infected froze, then lunged toward the noise with a terrifying burst of speed, hands grabbing blindly. The wire held. It went down hard on one knee, slamming its shoulder into the landing gear tire. It stayed there, motionless, like its body had forgotten the command for stand up. Then slowly it pushed back up and tried again, feeling along the line of the noise. I didn't move. I realized then, if noise pulled them in, noise could lead them away just as easily. After a tense minute, the thing lost interest. Another sound carried across the field, something closer to the terminal. Its head snapped in that direction. It turned and began to shamble away, leaving a crooked trail of prints in the snow. I waited until it was just a speck before I dared to stand up. My hands shook. Seeing these things on a screen hadn't prepared me for how wrong they looked up close. No humanity, no planning. Just a biological machine chasing whatever hit its ears. The trap had worked. It hadn't stopped the thing, but it gave me a signal and bought me reaction time. That was enough for now. I went down and added more tags to the cables. Out here, quiet and early warning were the only things keeping those tracks in the snow from turning into a highway leading right to my door. Once that first infected shambled past the plane without finding a way up the stairs, my world shrank. It contracted down to the wreck, the endless snow, and a short, brutal list of chores I had to repeat just to stay alive. Nobody handed me a schedule. There was no shift supervisor to check my work. The discipline came from a cold, hard knot in my gut that told me if I stopped moving even for a day, the plane would stop being a shelter and turn into a metal coffin with a dead man inside. Morning started before the sun even thought about rising, with my breath hanging in the freezing air like fog. The first job was always the stove. If there were any embers left glowing in the bottom of the drum, I fed them thin slivers of dry wood, coaxing the heat back to life. If only cold gray ash remained, I cursed under my breath, cleared it out with a small shovel, stacked fresh kindling, and lit a new fire. While the flames caught and the metal began to tick, I stood at the window watching the glass for any motion on the runway and listening for any sound on the hull that wasn't just the wind playing tricks on me. After the fire was stable, I walked the cabin. I moved from seat to seat, checking that latches were flush, verifying that the emergency exits hadn't shifted or popped a seal in the cold. It was part habit from 20 years of inspection work, but mostly it was a reminder that I still controlled at least one narrow, frozen stretch of the world. Once a day, usually around noon when the light was best, I left the cockpit and made a slow, deliberate circle outside. I walked around the nose, checking the tension on my tripwires and the placement of the tags. I scanned the snow for new tracks, human or otherwise. When I could, I brushed drifting snow away from the landing gear wheels and lower access panels so that any fresh scrape or disturbance would stand out like a neon sign. Inside, I kept shifting the layout of the front cabin until it felt defensible. I unbolted 4 seats from 2 rows in economy and dragged them up to the bulkhead, bolting them down sideways to create a low, makeshift wall. Behind that fortification went my food reserves, heavy tools, and anything I couldn't afford to lose in a hurry. The aisle stayed strictly clear from the cockpit door to the main exit, a straight shot with nothing loose to roll underfoot if I had to sprint. The cockpit door itself needed more than just a heavy tool case wedged against it. I raided a service cart for a solid steel push bar, cut it to length with a hacksaw, and bolted 2 heavy-duty brackets directly into the doorframe. At night, when I closed myself in, I dropped that steel bar into the brackets with a heavy thunk. Anything that wanted to get in would have to rip the frame out of the wall, and that meant noise. Lots of it. Insulation became a full-time job. Without engines running to bleed warm air, the plane lost heat faster than my little stove could replace it. I scavenged spare wool blankets, crinkly emergency foil sheets, and old cargo padding from the crew lockers. I hung them over the bare metal panels, lined the floor near the bulkhead, and used duct tape to seal gaps where I could feel icy drafts cutting across my hands. The cockpit started to look less like a flight deck and more like a padded cell, but it was warmer. Water was a constant grinding chore. Every bin of snow I dragged in melted down to a pathetic inch of water at the bottom of the pot. I kept a rotation going, one bin melting near the cockpit stove and one packing tight near the galley door, so there was always some ready. I measured every sip. Food meant math and risk assessment. The meager supplies from the galley and the vending machine loot wouldn't carry me far if I ate like a normal person. I cut my meals down to strict rules, something light and dry in the morning to get the stomach moving. A little more at midday, and the main meal, hot if possible, at night, when the darkness hit hardest and morale was lowest. On a clear, crisp day with absolutely no movement on the field, I took the truck down the service road to a storage building near the far end of the property. The main rolling doors were chained shut, but one side personnel door had a broken latch I remembered from months ago. Inside, it was silent as a tomb, just dust motes dancing in shafts of cold light and rows of wooden crates. I struck gold in 3 of them, boxes of sealed snack packs, instant noodles and freeze-dried meals meant for long-haul crews. I filled 2 large canvas bags until the seams strained, grabbed another heavy blanket and a commercial first aid kit from a dusty shelf, and got the hell out before the silence in that big empty building started to feel heavy, like it was watching me. Back at the plane, I added the new food to my stores and scratched fresh tallies on a plastic panel with a permanent marker. It wasn't a perfect ration plan, but seeing the marks gave me a sense of time. I could see exactly how fast I was burning through what I had. The days began to blur into a gray loop, but I kept small markers to tell them apart. Every 3 days, I went down to the tarmac, checked the truck battery, and started the engine, letting it idle long enough to keep it alive and warm. Once a week, I walked to the perimeter fence and back along a different line, watching for signs that anyone else, living or dead, was using the same path. Each time I climbed the stairs back into the wreck, the cockpit felt less like a place I was borrowing and more like the only room on Earth I still owned. The hardest part wasn't the cold or the hunger. It was the quiet between jobs. When the fire was crackling steady, the traps were set, and the checks were done, nothing demanded my hands. That was when the dangerous thoughts crept in, thoughts about leaving. I would catch myself staring out at the empty white runway, picturing the roads beyond the perimeter and the half-tank of fuel in the truck. But each time I played that movie in my head, the ending was the same. Highways jammed with stalled cars, doors hanging open like dead wings. People standing in the gaps, freezing with no plan and no water. One blocked exit, one pileup, and my truck would turn into a trap, a thin shell on 4 wheels with nowhere to go. Out here, mistakes still came with space around them. If I screwed up, I had a buffer. On the road, one mistake was the end, so I wrote new rules for myself on the back of another orange maintenance tag and taped it right next to the cockpit window, eye level. Stay with the wreck until you have a real destination, not just a panic direction. Do not leave on a day when you are tired, hungry, or angry. Check the field and the fence before you decide anything. If the plane is still safer than the road, you stay. Seeing those lines in my own scratchy handwriting helped. It turned the urge to run into just another item on the checklist to be evaluated. Feelings didn't respond to wrenches or logic, but they sat a lot quieter when I pinned them to clear conditions and followed them one cold, deliberate day at a time. Maya showed up on a gray afternoon when the wind wouldn't ease and the crust on the runway cracked under every step. I was in the cockpit with the stove on low and a pot of snow half melted on top when I saw a single figure at the far end of the field. She walked down the center line alone, checking the edges, glancing back now and then, and her path looked too careful to belong to something infected. I watched her through the glass until she was close enough that I could see a pack on her back and a strap across her chest. Then I slid the side window open just enough for my voice to carry and said, "Stop right there and don't come closer to the stairs." She flinched at the sound, turned toward the cockpit, raised both hands away from her gear and said, "Okay, I'm stopped. Just talk to me before you decide I'm a problem." A rifle hung from the strap, muzzle down, and she let it hang without touching it. I kept my eyes moving over the fence line and the service road and said, "What's your name?" She answered, "Maya," and added, "I came off the highway 2 days ago. I've been sitting in those trees watching this wreck, trying to decide if it's empty or if someone already lives in it." That could have been a line she had used before, so I kept going and said, "Anyone with you?" She shook her head once and said, "Not anymore." We were 3. One got sick and turned fast. The other panicked, grabbed our last running car and drove off while I was still trying to think. If someone is behind me now, it's not on purpose. The field stayed still and flat around her. No second figure stepped out of cover. No extra set of tracks crossed hers. It still could have been a trap, so I asked, "How long since you were bitten, scratched, or covered in anyone else's blood?" She answered without pause, "No bite, no scratch, and no blood that isn't mine. If I thought I might flip, I wouldn't walk toward a metal tube with one door. That would be suicide for me and for you." And I said, "If I let you in and you're lying about any of this, I'm finished. There is no backup plan after that." And she nodded once and said, "I know. You let me in, you check me, and if I'm wrong, you throw me back out. If you send me away now, the cold or something slower than both of us finishes the job. That's all that's left." I told her, "Set the rifle on the ground, stock first, barrel pointing away from the stairs, then take 5 steps back and keep your hands up where I can see them." And she answered, "Fine," then did exactly that, slow and clear, and waited without trying to sell me anything else. I left the window, moved down the aisle, and opened the main door just far enough to see the base of the stairs and the space around her boots. Up close, her face looked worse than it had from the cockpit. Her cheeks were cracked from wind, skin raw at the nose, and her fingers shook when she lowered her hands a little. There was no fever sheen in her eyes and no fixed stare at the hull. She looked like a person who had run out of better ideas and picked the least bad one left. From the top step, I said, "Come up 1 step at a time. 1 hand on the rail, 1 hand where I can see it. Stop when your boots hit the top plate and wait there." She answered, "Got it," and climbed like she knew a fall here would be the last mistake she could afford to make. At the top, she stopped on her own, boots lined to the edge, hands open and empty where I could see them. I checked what I could without stripping her in the cold. Sleeves, wrists, neck, the parts of her arms she could bear quickly. Old bruises, 1 fresh scrape, no teeth marks. I said, "Coat stays on, you look cold enough already. Drop the pack by that seat and sit where I can see your hands and your face at the same time." And she said, "Deal," then slipped the pack off and eased into the seat with a short sound that was more exhaustion than pain. She held her hands out toward the stove and watched the fire and me in turns. After a few seconds, she said, "Heat and high ground. You picked a smart hill to live on," and then added, "If you keep your head about it." I answered, "Heat and height only work if this wreck stays quiet and under control. Bringing someone new inside can wreck that if we handle it wrong." We laid out terms right there in the front cabin with our breath hanging in the air. I told her, "In this plane, noise and clear jobs keep you alive. No firing that rifle from the door unless there is no other choice. No shouting across the cabin, no slamming doors. Fuel and food get counted, and water is everyone's job because snow doesn't walk itself into the pot." She nodded through the list and said, "I can live with that. If I stay, I pull my weight and follow your system. I'm not here to take it over. I just don't want to die 10 yards from the only solid walls in sight." I said, "You stay on a trial basis. We get through the next stretch together, and then we both decide if this still makes sense." And she said, "Fair enough," then let out a long breath that sounded like it had been waiting since the trees. The wreck was not just mine anymore. For now it had two owners and one narrow shared plan. Rafi reached us on a morning that started sharper than the others. Frost lined the corners of the cockpit glass and every breath hung in the air before the stove even caught. I sat in the left seat with our food counts in front of me. Maya was a few rows back, sliding cans from one bin to another and calling out numbers. The wreck felt small, but the routine made sense. Out by the service road, a single figure moved along the fence, pushing a low cart. Even from that distance, I saw the bad leg first. One step, then a drag, then a catch. He stopped often, looked behind him, checked the trees and the empty lots, then pushed on. The infected I had watched from this glass did not move like that. They chased sharp sounds, not empty space. I brought the binoculars up and tracked him through the haze. 2 blue drums and a crate were tied to the cart with rope. The man wore a heavy coat, a hat pulled low, and a pack. His head turned in slow arcs. I said, "We have a man on the road with a cart and a bad leg." And Maya answered, "He is hurt, but he is not one of them. He looks and listens. They do not." When he stepped fully onto the open concrete by the nose, I slid the cockpit window open a hand's width and said, "Stop there and do not come closer to the stairs yet." He stopped at once, let the cart handles fall, raised both hands and said, "Good. Somebody is up there. I didn't want to die next to an empty plane." The cart sat 20 yards from the nose. I saw the tops of the drums and the crate between them. I said, "Name and what happened to your leg?" And he answered, "Rafi Collins. Fence line behind a depot 2 towns back. Bad wire, not teeth. It cut high. I cleaned it and wrapped it. It hurts, but it hasn't gone bad yet." I asked, "How many days since that happened?" And he said, 8 or 9. I am still counting. I don't want to guess wrong. Maya watched him in the cart and said, "Those drums are water or fuel. Either way, they are a reason for people to come back here if they see them." She was right. Extra water or food could keep us here for weeks, but could also put a price on the wreck. I asked, "What is in the drums and the crate?" And he said, "Water in both drums, cans and dry food in the crate. I can't guard it in the open much longer." We could have told him to leave the cart and walk away. That would have given us more supplies and no new risk. Instead, I said, "Walk to the base of the stairs and keep your hands up. You do not climb until we check you for bites." And he said, "Fair enough," then pushed the cart forward until the front wheel bumped the lowest step and stepped back. Maya and I went down together. She stayed to his left and watched his fingers. I stayed in front and checked what skin I could reach without stripping him in the wind. His wrists and neck were clear. The cut on his leg sat high under a stained wrap. We had him sit on the lowest step, peeled the cloth back, rinsed the wound with meltwater, and looked for the shape everyone feared. It was a straight tear from wire, red at the edges but not the half circle of teeth. We wrapped it with a clean bandage and told him to pull the cloth down again. I said, "You can come inside as far as the front rows. The cockpit stays ours. If this works, you sleep back here. That is not about rank. It is our last layer if something goes wrong." And he said, "You two have a cockpit. You would be stupid not to use it." Then stepped through the door slowly, careful not to brush the walls. We rolled the drums and the crate inside and left the empty cart under the wing with a tarp over it. When the door was shut and the bar was down, we gave him hot water and half a packet of crackers. He sat in a front row seat, hands on his knees, and let his shoulders drop. He looked at the blocked rows and the clear path to the exit and said, "You did careful work on this, Shell. One real way up, good sight lines, junk where it slows strangers, not you. Most people still chase houses. Houses have too many doors now." Maya said, "Doors were our first problem. This wreck fixed some of that, as long as we remember what it is and what it is not." And he nodded like he had already come to the same idea on the road. I went through our rules. I said, "No one fires a gun unless all 3 of us agree the noise is worth it. No loud tools without 2 people watching the field. No private food stashes. Water is everyone's job. If we ever leave this plane, we leave because we planned it, Not because someone runs, and he said, "I can live with that. I am tired of leaving because other people panic." With 3 people, the work shifted. One of us could sit in the cockpit while 2 went out to move snow, bring in wood, or roll a drum closer. We could sleep in longer blocks without feeling like the field might cross the distance while our eyes were shut. When we cleared ice from the wing, one scraped, one watched, and one stood by the door with a hand on the frame. More boots also meant more tracks and more chances for loud words. We taped one more line near the main door. When strangers come near, one person talks, one stands by the ladder, one watches the field. No new plans while engines run or boots touch the concrete. 2 days after Rafi joined us, that line mattered. Late in the afternoon, a low engine note rolled across the field from the service road. It grew from a hum to the uneven idle of more than one truck. I turned the stove down to cut the smoke and said, "Positions." Maya took the left front seat with the binoculars. That was enough. 30 days in this wreck taught me more about staying alive than 30 years before it ever did. I used to measure time in shifts and maintenance logs. Now I counted in stove loads, water pots, and how many times the tags on the warning lines rattle in a night. It is just a strip of concrete with one frozen plane that still makes sense to me. After the trucks came and went, the air felt tight in a way I trusted. Maya kept the binoculars up even after the last engine note faded. Rafi sat in the front row with his hand on his bandaged leg, watching the fence where the convoy had vanished. I stood by the cockpit door and said, "That is our answer. We don't call out. We don't trade from a doorway. We let them decide this place isn't worth the trouble." Maya lowered the glass and said, "If they had seen one of us wave, they would be back with more people and a real plan." And Rafi added, "If they come back anyway, it won't be because we invited them." Out here, being worth the effort was almost as dangerous as infection. That night, we rewrote the last part of our rules and taped a fresh strip by the door. The first lines were the same ones I had written when it was just me and the stove. Live higher than what you can't fight. Keep noise smaller than the wind. Fix what you can before it fails. The new lines came from having 2 more pairs of hands and 2 more sets of mistakes. We added, "No deals at the fence," and "If someone wants what we have, we make them look somewhere else first." We added 3 votes for gunfire, and "No one leaves the wreck alone unless 2 jobs can't wait." It didn't feel simple when boots crunched on the service road, but the list helped when fear tried to take over. By the end of the first 30 days, the wreck no longer felt like something I had stolen. It felt like a place we had earned. The cockpit was our room. The front rows held food, tools, and water. The drums by the door were no longer Rafi's or mine or Maya's. They were the reason we could sit still a little longer and think about more than the next 12 hours. We fell into a pattern that didn't care what the calendar said. At first light, one of us checked the traps and wheel lines from a window. If nothing moved, 2 of us went out to shake ice from the tags and brush snow away from the hull so we could see fresh marks. The third stayed in the cockpit with the binoculars and a hand on the hatch bar. Most days, the only tracks we saw were our own, half filled by drift. Sometimes we found the crooked lines of the infected where they had wandered through in the night, or straighter prints that didn't belong to us. Inside, jobs split clean. Maya handled food and the small medical kit. She checked cans, pulled anything risky, and counted calories. Rafi took water and fuel. He watched our drums, managed melt pots, and checked the stovepipe for leaks. I took the hull. I walked the legs after every wind, checked bolts and panels, and made sure nothing we added turned into a new weak point. We didn't always agree. Once, when snow piled high against the service road, Rafi said, "We should take the truck and see if anyone left equipment at the far hangars. Another heater, more drums, anything we can move." It was also a full day of driving past blind corners and glass doors. Maya said, "We have enough for now. Every new thing we drag back is another reason for strangers to mark this place." And I pointed at the strip by the door and said, "No one leaves alone, and we don't chase more than one big job at a time." We stayed. That was how most arguments went. Someone brought up a plan. Someone else pointed at the rules. We bent a little or we didn't, but we ended by writing the new version down so the next hard call didn't start from zero. It was 3 people trying to remember they were on the same side of the door. There were quiet hours when I sat in the left seat, watched the empty runway, and thought about what came after the wreck. Somewhere beyond this, there might be a farm that held, or a small town that locked down early. I didn't pretend there was a safe zone. I just wanted to know if there was anywhere better than this plane. Each time I played it out, I came back to the same picture. The wreck gave us height, walls, and a routine. The road would give us motion, noise, and problems we couldn't see coming. The wreck had limits I understood. The road had limits I could only guess at. Staying wasn't bravery and it wasn't fear. It was the only choice that didn't feel like closing my eyes and hoping. On the 30th night, I sat with Maya and Rafi in the dim light from the stove. Snow tapped now and then against the glass. I read the rules out loud from the strip by the door. When I finished, Rafi said, "You know, this is more structure than my last job ever had." And Maya said, "Then your last job should have hired him sooner." I looked around the cockpit and the front cabin and saw everything we had changed in a month. The stovepipe, the bar across the door, the stacked supplies, the worn path between the seats. None of it was pretty. All of it worked. I said, "This plane was never meant to be a home, but it is one now. As long as it gives us height and heat and time to think, we treat it like it is worth our work." We didn't toast anything or talk about the future like it was promised. We checked the stove, checked the traps, and set the next watch. 30 days in, that was what survival looked like for us. No heroics, no last stand. Just 3 people in a frozen cockpit following their own rules in a wreck that still, for now, held. If you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. See you in the next one.